6 a.m. My father's funeral was in 4 hours. That's when they came with sledgehammers. Crack, crack, crack. My handmade chicken coop, 3 months of grief therapy after losing my wife obliterated in 12 minutes. Fresh cedar splinters mixed with morning dew as my terrified hens scattered across the yard. The smell of sawdust and crushed marigolds from my wife's memorial garden filled the air. The HOA president? She posted photos on Facebook with laughing emojis, called it a lesson for people who don't belong. What she didn't know, what nobody knew, was that buried 6 feet beneath my boots sat a 60-year-old drainage valve, one rusty handle that controlled the flow to their $5 million resort lake. The same lake that kept 347 property values sky high. The same lake that made their McMansions worth triple what they paid. One twist, 48 hours, mudflats. What would you do if your HOA did this during your parents' funeral? Tell me where you're watching from, because I guarantee your HOA has pulled similar garbage. My name's Jasper Crawford Jazz to anyone who matters. And 6 months ago, I thought I knew exactly how screwed I was. Third-generation electrician, recently widowed, caring for a father who calls me Tommy half the time because dementia's a real son of a bitch. I inherited 2 acres in Willowbrook Estates from my grandmother in 2019. Now, Willowbrook's the kind of place where people spend more on lawn care than most folks make in a month. McMansions worth $800,000, HOA dues that could fund a small country, and neighbors who measure your grass with actual rulers. Here's what made my property special, and I use that term loosely. It sits at the natural low point of the entire development. Every drop of rain, every sprinkler overspray, every storm drain for 347 homes eventually flows through my land toward Willowbrook Resort Lake. That $5 million crown jewel where Instagram influencers pose and tech bros hold their weddings. After my wife Sarah died from cancer, I built a chicken coop. Not because I'd gone country, because grief makes you do weird shit, and hammering nails felt better than hammering whiskey. Spent 3 months hand-selecting every cedar board, built it right where my grandmother's chickens had lived since 1959. The smell of fresh pine shavings, the sound of Henrietta pecking at morning corn, it kept me sane when everything else felt like it was falling apart. What I didn't know was that 6 feet beneath my boots, my grandmother had left me the world's most valuable inheritance. Buried in her basement records, I'd found a cryptic note. Emergency drainage controls for wet seasons, manual valve, storm system connection. Figured it was old farming nonsense. Turns out that nonsense controlled 73% of the water flow to the neighborhood's precious lake. Enter our villain. Delilah Thornfield, HOA board president and professional pain in the ass. 48, blonde, drives a white Range Rover with plates reading Horain because subtlety died the same year as shame, apparently. She moved here 5 years ago, married to Preston, who just happens to run the development company eyeing lake expansion. Delilah's the type who wears Louboutins to check her mailbox and has never encountered a problem she couldn't solve by calling someone's manager. The violation notice arrived on a Tuesday, crisp as fresh-pressed hatred. Unauthorized agricultural structure, $500 fine, escalating $100 daily until removed. I called to explain. Grief therapy, recent loss. You know what this compassionate community leader said? Mr. Crawford, grief doesn't exempt you from community standards. The texture of that letter crumpling in my work-hardened hands. The way Delilah's manicured voice cut through the phone like broken glass. Right then, standing next to my therapeutic chicken coop, while my father forgot my name upstairs, something crystallized. I requested a variance hearing, denied without review, asked for mediation. Not necessary. 30-day extension? Absolutely not. See, here's the thing about Willowbrook Estates. It's built on a house of cards made of property values. That resort lake keeps 347 homes worth double what people paid. Wedding venue bookings, fishing tournaments, those sunset paddleboard yoga classes that rich women Instagram. Remove the lake? Property values crater by 40% overnight. My modest ranch house sits among these monuments to mortgage debt like a working man's middle finger, which makes it a target. And targets, well, they tend to get eliminated. I hung up the phone and watched Henrietta chase a grasshopper across the yard. The morning air carried the scent of fresh cedar, and that particular smell of lake water just after sunrise, clean, promising, valuable. What Delilah didn't know, what nobody knew, was that my worthless corner of paradise came with a kill switch. One rusty valve handle that could turn their $5 million lake into the world's most expensive mud puddle. But first, I had to figure out if I had the guts to use it. 3 days later, my mailbox delivered a legal grenade disguised as a certified letter. Thornfield and Associates Legal Services, because of course our HOA president runs her own law firm. Nothing screams fair and balanced like being judge, jury, and executioner all rolled into one perfectly manicured package. The paper felt expensive between my fingers, that heavy stock lawyers use when they want you to know you're about to get financially violated. Notice of legal action, immediate cessation required. 3 separate covenant violations, $2,000 in administrative fees, and a 72-hour deadline that started ticking while my father lay in hospice calling for his dead mother. But Delilah made her first rookie mistake. Those violation photos were shot from my neighbor's property. I could tell from the angle, the fence post lurking in the corner like a photographic confession. Thanks to 20 years of electrical work, I'd learned that documentation beats intimidation every single time. That weekend, I installed 4 security cameras with night vision. It cost me $800 I couldn't afford, but my grandfather used to say, "Knowledge is expensive, but ignorance costs everything." Turns out the old bastard was right about more than just poker. While running cable for the cameras, I decided to dig into HOA covenant law. 3 hours of reading county regulations that could cure insomnia, but buried in the bureaucratic word salad, was pure gold. Delilah never filed proper amendments with the county. Her agricultural restrictions, legally worthless without county planning approval. I'd seen this same mistake on commercial jobs where contractors tried cutting corners on permits. The real jackpot was waiting in Grandma's basement files, wedged between 40 years of seed catalogs and fertilizer receipts. Original 1959 property survey, musty as a tomb and twice as valuable. My chicken coop sat on the exact footprint of Grandma's original hen house, predating the HOA by 37 years. Grandfathered agricultural use, legal as apple pie and twice as American. I filed a counterclaim citing continuous agricultural use since Eisenhower was president. The smell of old ink and decades-old paper mixed with the sweet satisfaction of watching legal bullies choke on their own paperwork. Then my cameras caught something that made my coffee taste like victory. 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, motion alert buzzing my phone like an angry hornet. There's Preston Thornfield, Delilah's development company husband, creeping around my property with professional surveying equipment. The infrared footage showed him ghostly white against the darkness, measuring distances and taking photos like he was planning to build a goddamn shopping mall. 43 minutes of trespassing, documented in high-definition detail. But here's the kicker: I recognized that equipment from electrical jobs at construction sites. Preston wasn't just harassing me for kicks. This was pre-development reconnaissance, the kind you do before filing permit applications. The next morning found me at the county planning office, drowning in public records that smelled like bureaucracy and broken dreams. After 45 minutes of paper cuts and eye strain, I struck oil. Preliminary development applications for Willowbrook Resort Phase 2, submitted by Preston's company. The expansion required access easement across my property. My worthless 2 acres sat at the perfect drainage point for their resort expansion. They couldn't afford to buy me out at fair value, so they'd drive me out through HOA harassment, then snatch my land at a foreclosure auction for pennies on the dollar. Clever, evil, and about to backfire spectacularly. That afternoon, Delilah called with her kindergarten teacher about to lose her shit voice. "Mr. Crawford, we've reviewed your county filing. Very clever. But the board has authorized immediate removal of your structure if you don't comply voluntarily." Meaning what exactly? "Contractors standing by. Your deadline is tomorrow at noon." The line went dead with a click that echoed like a coffin lid. I sat there holding the phone, listening to the dial tone buzz against my ear like electronic laughter. But something else was buzzing to my brain, connecting dots I hadn't seen before. My property wasn't just at the neighborhood's low point geographically. It was the drainage control point for the entire development. And somewhere in Grandma's basement files, I'd seen references to emergency drainage controls and manual valve systems. That evening, I stood on my back porch watching Henrietta chase grasshoppers while the setting sun turned the lake into liquid gold. The air carried the scent of fresh cedar from my coop and that clean smell of lake water just after sunset, peaceful as a Norman Rockwell painting. But beneath my boots, 6 feet down in the dark, something waited. Some piece of 1960s infrastructure that my grandmother had controlled for 60 years. And if Preston wanted my land badly enough to commit trespassing and fraud to get it, maybe that buried secret was worth more than I'd ever imagined. Tomorrow, Delilah would find out what happens when you threaten a man with nothing left to lose. Delilah's deadline came and went like a fart in church, loud, embarrassing, and ultimately meaningless. Noon Tuesday found me sipping sweet tea on my porch, watching 3 contractors in hard hats mill around my chicken coop like confused tourists. Turns out grandfathered agricultural rights have more bite than HOA legal threats. But victory has a way of making your enemies desperate. And desperate people do stupid, vindictive shit. Thursday evening, my phone exploded with notifications that made my stomach feel like I'd swallowed broken glass. Emergency HOA meeting, Friday night. Agenda: addressing health and safety hazards in Willowbrook Estates. Every homeowner got the notice except me, a little oversight I discovered when my neighbor Janet texted asking if I was dying of some exotic chicken disease. Friday at 7 p.m., while I was elbow deep in a restaurant's electrical panel that smelled like grease and desperation, Delilah held her show trial. 30 neighbors packed into the clubhouse to watch a PowerPoint presentation that would have made Joseph Goebbels proud. "Chickens attract rats," she proclaimed, clicking through slides of my hens like they were evidence in a murder trial. "Rats carry disease. Disease impacts property values. This agricultural operation poses a direct financial threat to our community." The logic was bulletproof if you ignored science, zoning laws, and basic human decency. But fear sells better than facts, especially when those facts might cost you $50,000 in home equity. Board vote, 4-1 to authorize immediate hazard removal within 48 hours. They even gave themselves permission to trespass on my property for community safety. Because nothing says safety like breaking and entering with power tools. I learned all this from Janet's husband Mark, who filmed the whole circus on his phone. Watching that footage later, seeing Delilah's practiced smile as she assassinated my character in high definition, something cold and calculating crystallized in my chest. 2 could play the public opinion game. I'd started a Facebook group called Willowbrook Property Rights right after her first legal threat, posted historical photos showing our neighborhood as working farmland, shared Preston's midnight trespassing footage, told my story about HOA harassment during family crisis. Within a week, 87 neighbors had joined, sharing their own tales of Delilah's reign of terror. Margaret Chen, $3,000 fine for parking her disabled son's wheelchair van in her own driveway, too many consecutive days. Bill Rodriguez, violations for growing tomatoes in raised beds smaller than most flower gardens. The Hendersons, legal action for installing a wheelchair ramp without architectural committee approval. Pattern recognition isn't rocket science. Delilah targeted anyone who disrupted her suburban fantasy disabled access, ethnic gardens, working-class vehicles, grief therapy chickens. All threats to the pristine aesthetic that kept property values climbing toward heaven. But Facebook was just foreplay. The real move was Heritage Day, a neighborhood potluck featuring fresh eggs from my supposedly plague-carrying hens. 63 neighbors showed up on Sunday afternoon, sharing stories about the area's farming history while their kids collected warm eggs and fed Henrietta by hand. The smell of charcoal and fresh corn mixed with children's laughter and the sound of hens clucking contentedly in their run. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, my property felt alive with purpose instead of poisoned by conflict. That's when Margaret Chen dropped the bomb that changed everything. "Jazz," she whispered, pulling me aside near the vegetable garden Sarah never got to finish. I used to do real estate title research. I looked up Delilah's business filings. She glanced around like we were planning a bank heist. Her firm represents the resort developers. She's been collecting pre-sale commissions on Phase 2. Every puzzle piece clicked into place with the satisfying snap of a perfectly fitted joint. Delilah wasn't enforcing community standards. She was clearing inventory for a payday that would make her rich enough to buy her own lake. But Margaret saved the best for last. While diving through property records, she'd found something that made my grandmother's old farming notes suddenly relevant. Original 1962 county drainage maps showing my property as the manual flood control point for the entire development. That night, armed with a flashlight and my grandfather's shovel, I went treasure hunting in my own basement. 2 hours of digging through dirt that smelled like decades of secrets, my blade finally rang against metal. 6 feet down, wrapped in oiled canvas like pirate treasure, lay a valve wheel connected to a pipe thick as my forearm. The metal was cold and rough under my work gloves, but it turned smooth as silk when I gave it a gentle quarter rotation. 20 minutes later, the retention pond behind my house had dropped 2 inches. I stared at that valve wheel in the beam of my flashlight, understanding flooding through me like ice water. My therapeutic chicken coop wasn't just built over any random patch of dirt, it sat directly above the drainage control system for 347 homes and one $5 million lake. Delilah wanted to play dirty? I was sitting on the game board. Monday morning arrived like a bureaucratic apocalypse delivered via certified mail. My phone started ringing at 6 a.m. with violation reports that read like the fever dreams of a suburban dictator with too much time and not enough therapy. Violation number 1. Unsightly commercial vehicle disrupting residential aesthetic. My work truck, the same Ford F-150 that had fixed half the neighborhood's electrical problems, including Delilah's garage door opener last Christmas. Violation number 2. Excessive noise disturbance during designated quiet hours. Joe. The backup alarm that beeped for exactly 12 seconds while I reversed out of my own driveway. Apparently my truck's safety features were now crimes against humanity. Violation number 3. Unauthorized frequent visitors creating parking congestion. The hospice nurses caring for my dying father. Because nothing says community values like harassing medical professionals during a family crisis. By Friday, I'd collected 12 violations like Pokemon cards from hell. Total fines, $8,400 and climbing faster than gas prices. Each notice arrived with the crisp efficiency of paper cuts designed to bleed your bank account dry. But Delilah's masterpiece was violation number 12, disturbing community peace through excessive emotional displays. Translation: crying at my father's bedside was now an HOA infraction because it made joggers uncomfortable during their morning virtue signaling sessions. The smell of antiseptic and approaching death filled my father's hospice room while I read legal threats about my grief being a municipal code violation. If Satan ran a homeowners association, Delilah would be his star pupil. But here's what happens when you corner a man who's already lost everything. He stops playing defense and starts looking for weapons. My Facebook group had mushroomed to 200 members after Heritage Day. Each violation notice I posted sparking more outrage than a referee's bad call at the Super Bowl. The comments section became a support group for HOA survivors, sharing war stories that made my chicken coop dispute look like a parking ticket. Then Rebecca Martinez from Channel 7's On Your Side reached out. She'd been monitoring our social media shitstorm and smelled ratings gold-wrapped in righteous fury. A widowed electrician being bullied during family tragedy? That's journalism crack. The TV crew arrived Wednesday afternoon, cameras rolling as Rebecca interviewed me next to Henrietta's coop. The late afternoon light caught the cedar boards Sarah had helped me pick out, golden and warm against the green backdrop of my therapeutic garden. 6 neighbors testified on camera about their own encounters with Delilah's petty tyranny. But the smoking gun was Preston's midnight trespassing footage. High-definition infrared video of a development executive surveying private property with professional equipment. That's the kind of evidence that makes news directors wet themselves with excitement. The story aired Friday at 6 p.m. Grieving widower targeted by HOA during family crisis. Footage of my father's empty wheelchair, violation notices stacked on my kitchen table, then a slow zoom on Delilah's lakefront mansion. Pure cinematic storytelling that went viral faster than a TikTok dance. Local Reddit exploded. Facebook groups shared it across 3 counties. The comment section became a digital pitchfork mob demanding Delilah's head on a spike made of HOA bylaws. But the real game changer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Chen Margaret's sister and an environmental scientist at State contacted me after the broadcast. She'd caught my throwaway comment about controlling neighborhood drainage and wanted to understand my property's role in the local watershed. People don't realize how suburban development stresses natural water systems, she explained over coffee that tasted like academic curiosity mixed with revolutionary potential. When you convert farmland to housing, you're fundamentally rewiring how water moves through the landscape. Her maps looked like anatomical diagrams, showing storm runoff from 347 rooftops channeling through underground arteries toward the resort lake. Someone with access to the original manual valve system could theoretically control water flow for the entire development. My coffee suddenly tasted like liquid leverage. That weekend, I conducted my own research with the precision of a man who'd finally found his purpose. Quarter-turn valve adjustments, documented with time-lapse photography that showed retention pond levels dropping like a drunk man's standards. A half-turn completely drained the decorative fountain at the clubhouse. By Sunday, I understood the full scope of my inheritance. Grandmother hadn't just left me 2 acres. She'd left me the power to control the economic lifeblood of Willowbrook Estates. Monday brought the validation I needed. Resort management called an emergency board meeting. Wedding cancellations were mounting. Negative reviews mentioned community instability. Bad publicity was costing real money, the kind that makes rich people panic and working stiffs smile. Delilah's response was predictably unhinged. She hired a private investigator to document my every breath, catalog each dandelion in my lawn, photograph visitors like I was running a drug cartel instead of mourning my father. But desperation breeds stupidity. Thursday night, my cameras caught 3 contractor trucks idling outside my house like mechanical vultures. My father died Tuesday morning. The funeral was Friday at 10 a.m. Delilah's plan was elegant in its cruelty. Destroy the evidence while I buried my dad. She had no idea what waited 6 feet beneath my boots. Friday morning, 6 a.m. 4 hours until my father's funeral, and I was standing in my bathrobe watching 3 assholes with sledgehammers turn my grief therapy into splinters while their cameras rolled like this was some twisted reality show. Crack, crack, crack. 3 months of healing, destroyed in 12 minutes, the smell of fresh cedar mixed with Henrietta's panicked squawking as she and her sisters scattered like feathered refugees across my yard. My security cameras captured every illegal swing, every trespassing footstep, every violation of property rights that would make the Founding Fathers spin in their graves. But rock bottom has its advantages. It's a solid foundation for building something dangerous. While Delilah's demolition crew left my property looking like a construction site had angry sex with a tornado, I was in my basement, digging through my grandmother's papers with the laser focus of a man who'd finally found his true calling. The 1962 correspondence with county flood control wasn't just bureaucratic paperwork. It was a legal nuclear weapon disguised as boring government letters, page after page of negotiations between Grandma Crawford and county engineers, establishing what they called perpetual easement rights for manual flood control maintenance. The language was dry as month-old toast, but the implications were explosive. The county had paid my grandmother $500 annually until 1987 to maintain active flood control infrastructure. The payment stopped when some pencil pusher decided the system was obsolete, but the legal rights, those transferred automatically to property heirs. Me. My hands still shaking with grief and rage, I called the county engineering department. Rosa Martinez, the current water systems engineer, sounded like the kind of woman who actually read the fine print in government contracts. Mr. Crawford, she said, papers rustling like autumn leaves through the phone. According to our records, your family has maintained flood control easement rights since 1962. The original agreement supersedes any HOA covenants, municipal ordinances, or private restrictions. Translation: Delilah's HOA could kiss my legally protected ass. But Rosa's next revelation made my coffee taste like liquid revenge. That valve system controls approximately 73% of water input to the resort lake. Full closure would drop lake levels 8 to 12 feet within 1 week, depending on rainfall. I stared at the crater where my chicken coop used to stand, understanding washing over me like baptism by fire. Delilah hadn't just destroyed my therapeutic project, she'd unknowingly declared war on the one person who could turn her $5 million lakefront paradise into the world's most expensive mud wrestling arena. The engineering maps Rosa emailed painted the complete picture in beautiful, terrifying detail. Storm drains from 347 homes, 3 retention ponds, and 2 commercial developments all fed through underground arteries that my valve controlled like a cardiac surgeon with a scalpel. Close that valve, and the resort's pristine beach would become a mosquito breeding ground visible from low Earth orbit. The dock where wedding parties posed for photos would sit on exposed lake bottom like a monument to poor planning. Property values would crater faster than my hopes for a peaceful retirement 30 to 40% overnight. Delilah's development dreams, worthless paper. Preston's Phase 2 expansion, dead on arrival. But here's the beautiful, terrifying truth. As the legal controller of flood management infrastructure, I had every right to operate that valve. No permits required, no HOA approval needed, no legal recourse for anyone affected by my maintenance activities. My grandmother hadn't just left me 2 acres and a broken heart, she'd left me the power to protect or destroy an entire community's financial future. That afternoon, while Delilah probably celebrated her demolition victory with champagne and sociopathic glee, I stood over my buried valve, understanding exactly what leverage really meant. She'd wanted to destroy a grieving widower's last source of comfort. Now she was about to learn what happened when you declared war on a man who controlled the water. By Saturday morning, my kitchen looked like a war room designed by caffeinated revolutionaries. Maps covered every surface, legal documents stacked like ammunition, and coffee rings marked strategic positions on my grandmother's old dining table where 4 very different people planned the downfall of a suburban tyrant. Marcus Webb, my newly appointed legal counsel, had retired from environmental law at 61, but came out of retirement faster than a firehorse when he heard my story. Tall, silver-haired, and possessed of the kind of quiet intensity that made opposing attorneys wet themselves, Marcus had moved to Willowbrook 3 months ago specifically to escape HOA drama. Life's got a sense of humor like a drunk comedian. Rosa Martinez, the county engineer who'd confirmed my valve rights, sat across from him reviewing watershed maps with the focused precision of someone who understood that water flows downhill and bullshit flows uphill. She'd volunteered her Saturday because, in her words, Delilah Thornfield has been a pain in my department's ass for 5 years. Tommy Tank Morrison completed our unlikely trinity. A local contractor built like a refrigerator with a grudge. Tank had his own beef with the HOA after they'd fined him $2,000 for parking his work truck in his own driveway during community event weekends. He brought homemade donuts that tasted like justice and practical knowledge about how things actually got built in the real world. Eleanor Pratt, our secret weapon, was a 72-year-old retired county clerk who knew where every bureaucratic body was buried. She'd shown up unannounced with 3 boxes of public records and a smile that suggested she'd been waiting her entire career for this moment. "Honey," Eleanor said, spreading documents across my counter like tarot cards predicting Delilah's doom, "I've been watching that woman abuse the system for years." Time somebody reminded her that laws apply to everybody, even HOA presidents with delusions of adequacy. Marcus had spent Friday night reviewing my grandmother's easement documents with the thoroughness of a forensic accountant auditing the mob. His verdict was unequivocal. My water rights were ironclad, predating the HOA by decades, and absolutely unassailable in court. "Jasper, you don't just have the right to operate that valve," he explained, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd won bigger fights than this. "You have the legal obligation to maintain flood control infrastructure. If anything, the HOA has been interfering with your federal easement duties." Rosa had spent her weekend creating professional engineering diagrams that showed exactly what my valve controlled. Her maps looked like circulatory system drawings for a mechanical heart, with my property as the crucial ventricle pumping life through Willowbrook's artificial ecosystem. "Full closure would violate no environmental regulations," she confirmed, pointing to flow charts that made my head spin. "The original system was designed with manual override capabilities for flood management. You'd essentially be returning the watershed to its pre-development state. Tank's contribution was more practical, but equally valuable. He'd organized what he called Neighborhood Watch among the dozen contractors and blue-collar workers who'd joined my Facebook group. They'd create a rotating surveillance schedule to document any more harassment, intimidation, or property damage. "These HOA assholes think working people don't fight back," Tank growled around a mouthful of glazed donut. "Time to show them what happens when you mess with somebody who actually knows how to build things." Eleanor had been the busiest of all. Her 3 boxes contained property records for every HOA board member, revealing conflicts of interest that would make an ethics professor weep. 2 other board members owned development company stock. The treasurer's wife worked for the same law firm handling Phase 2 permits. The secretary's brother-in-law was the general contractor bidding on resort expansion. "This isn't just corruption," Eleanor declared with the satisfaction of someone who'd been keeping score for decades. "This is criminal conspiracy disguised as community governance." Our strategy crystallized over the course of 6 hours and enough coffee to float a battleship. Phase 1. Present my easement rights to the HOA with a formal demand to cease harassment and provide full restitution for property damage. Give them 72 hours to respond like civilized human beings. Phase 2. If they continued their harassment campaign, demonstrate valve control with a minor adjustment, just enough to drop lake levels visibly without causing permanent damage. Sometimes you have to show your weapon before people believe you're serious about using it. Phase 3. Full media disclosure of valve control capabilities and board corruption. Let public pressure and negative publicity force them to negotiate reasonable terms. Phase 4. If all else failed, legal action with Marcus wielding environmental law like a chainsaw through their HOA covenants. The emergency option remained unspoken but understood. Full valve closure if they escalated to property destruction again. I'd spent my Saturday learning that I wasn't fighting alone anymore. Tank had connections throughout the blue-collar community. Rosa had allies in county government. Marcus knew environmental lawyers across 3 states. Eleanor had dirt on half the county commissioners. But most importantly, I'd learned that knowledge really is power, especially when that knowledge involves controlling the thing that keeps your enemy's property values from collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. Sunday evening, I stood over my valve one more time, understanding exactly what Sunday morning would bring. Monday morning brought psychological warfare disguised as community concern. Delilah had apparently spent her weekend crafting a character assassination campaign that would have impressed the KGB if they'd specialized in suburban nightmare scenarios. Anonymous flyers appeared in every mailbox except mine, featuring my driver's license photo clearly obtained through illegal means, alongside warnings about my deteriorating mental state following multiple family tragedies. The flyers suggested I'd become a potential danger to neighborhood children and pets, and recommended residents maintain safe distances and report suspicious activities. By Tuesday, fake online reviews started appearing about my electrical business. 1-star rants claiming I'd left homes unsafe and damaged property during installations. The reviews were obviously manufactured to mention work I'd supposedly done in cities I'd never visited, and one criticized my unprofessional attitude during a job that happened while I was at my wife's funeral. But Delilah's masterpiece was the phone calls to my commercial clients. 3 businesses canceled contracts after receiving anonymous tips about my lawsuit troubles and unstable personal situation. She was systematically destroying my livelihood while painting herself as a concerned community leader protecting innocent families from a grieving madman. Wednesday's HOA board meeting included a special safety discussion about residents who might pose risks during emotional crises. They didn't mention my name, but the PowerPoint slides included photos of my property, my truck, and security footage of me working in my yard. Delilah had turned my grief into a public safety issue. The Whisper campaign worked like suburban wildfire. 3 neighbors who'd previously supported me started avoiding eye contact at the mailbox. Parents steered their kids away from my property like I was harboring weapons-grade plutonium instead of mourning my father. But here's what happens when you corner a man who's already lost everything and recently discovered he owns the nuclear option. You force him to make some very dangerous decisions. Thursday night, I called an emergency meeting of my war council. Marcus arrived with a legal briefcase full of righteous fury. Rosa brought updated engineering data that made my valve control look even more devastating. Tank showed up with surveillance photos that would have made the FBI jealous. Eleanor carried a file folder thick as a phone book, packed with evidence of HOA corruption that could topple governments. "She's trying to drive you crazy enough to do something stupid," Marcus observed, studying the fake reviews on his laptop. "It's a classic isolation strategy: destroy your support network, eliminate your income, then wait for you to snap so she can justify whatever comes next." Rosa's new data revealed something that made my coffee taste like liquid revenge. Recent county assessments showed the resort lake's property tax valuation at $47 million across all affected properties. A 12-foot water level drop would reduce that valuation by approximately $18 million, creating tax assessment appeals that would tie up county resources for years. "She's not just attacking you personally," Rosa explained, pointing to spreadsheets that looked like financial weapons. "She's betting everything on you being too civilized to use the power you have." That's when Tank dropped the bombshell that changed everything. His surveillance network had been monitoring Delilah's activities since the demolition, and they'd discovered something that made her character assassination campaign look like amateur hour. "Jazz, she's planning to file a restraining order tomorrow morning," Tank announced, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen the paperwork. "Claims you've made terrorist threats against the community. Says you're planning to poison the water supply and destroy property values through environmental sabotage." The accusations were based entirely on fabricated witness statements from board members who'd suddenly remembered threatening conversations that never happened. The restraining order would prevent me from attending HOA meetings, accessing community areas, or even walking past certain properties. It would also destroy any remaining credibility I had with potential clients. Eleanor's research had uncovered the real reason for Delilah's desperation. The Phase 2 development deal included performance deadlines tied to property acquisition. If Preston's company couldn't secure my land by December 31st, they'd forfeit their $500,000 development deposit and lose exclusive building rights worth millions. "She's not just harassing you for fun," Eleanor explained, adjusting her reading glasses with the precision of someone delivering a death sentence. "She's facing financial ruin if this development deal collapses. That makes her desperate enough to do anything. But desperation cuts both ways. Friday morning, I stood over my valve with a wrench in my hand and 48 hours to decide whether I was brave enough to fight fire with fire. Delilah wanted to destroy my reputation, my business, and my right to exist peacefully in my own community. She'd turned my grief into a weapon and my loss into a public spectacle. Time to show her what real power looked like. I turned the valve one full rotation counterclockwise and started my stopwatch. The lake level began dropping immediately. In 24 hours, Delilah would wake up to a very different view from her lakefront mansion. Game on. Saturday morning dawned with the kind of crystal-clear sky that makes you believe in divine justice. By 6 a.m., my phone was buzzing like an angry hornet's nest with messages I'd been waiting months to receive. The first call came from Janet Henderson, my neighbor who'd been quietly supportive throughout Delilah's reign of terror. Her voice carried the breathless excitement of someone witnessing a miracle disguised as a natural disaster. "Jazz, you need to see what's happening at the lake. The water level. Jesus Christ, what did you do?" By 7 a.m., I had my answer. The resort lake had dropped 4 feet overnight. The pristine beach where Instagram influencers posed for engagement photos now featured 20 yards of exposed lake bottom that smelled like primordial soup mixed with dead fish. The decorative dock where $50,000 weddings happened extended uselessly over mud flats that looked like the surface of an alien planet. But the real entertainment was watching Delilah's morning jog turn into a psychological breakdown captured in high definition by my security cameras. She appeared at 7:15 a.m. in her designer running gear, expecting to complete her usual lakefront route past properties worth more than most people's retirement funds. Instead, she encountered an ecological nightmare that would make property appraisers weep and wedding planners commit suicide. The sound she made, part scream, part sob, part primal howl of financial terror, carried across the empty lake bed like the mating call of a dying investment portfolio. She stood there for 8 minutes, staring at exposed dock pilings that rose from the mud like the ribs of some prehistoric beast, her perfect suburban world literally draining away before her eyes. My phone rang constantly throughout the morning. Panicked homeowners, confused resort staff, hysterical wedding planners whose Saturday ceremonies were about to become mud wrestling events. Each call was a small victory, proof that my grandmother's buried gift was working exactly as designed. But Delilah's response was predictably desperate and characteristically evil. By noon, she'd organized an emergency board meeting disguised as a community crisis response. Her plan was elegant in its simplicity: blame the lake drainage on my terrorist sabotage, and use the crisis to justify immediate legal action that would remove me from the community permanently. The meeting agenda, leaked to me by Janet Reese, the board secretary who'd become my secret ally, read like a prosecutor's opening statement. Environmental terrorism by unstable resident, community safety measures, and emergency property seizure procedures. Delilah was planning to paint me as an eco-terrorist who'd destroyed the neighborhood's water supply out of grief-induced madness. She'd invited the county sheriff, ostensibly for community safety, but really to arrest me on fabricated charges the moment I showed my face. She'd also contacted 3 local TV stations, planning to position herself as the brave community leader protecting innocent families from a dangerous lunatic. But here's what Delilah didn't know. I'd spent Friday night preparing for exactly this scenario. Rosa Martinez had provided official county documentation confirming my legal authority over flood control infrastructure. Marcus Webb had prepared a comprehensive legal brief explaining easement rights in language simple enough for TV news consumers. Tank Morrison had organized 50 supporters to attend the meeting, turning Delilah's kangaroo court into a hostile audience that understood exactly who the real villain was. Most importantly, Eleanor Pratt had spent the week preparing a presentation that would expose 5 years of HOA corruption, illegal meetings, embezzled funds, and development kickbacks that made Delilah's character assassination campaign look like amateur hour. Sunday afternoon brought the validation I'd been waiting for. Resort management called an emergency meeting with county officials demanding immediate investigation into infrastructure failures that were costing them hundreds of thousands in canceled bookings. Wedding venues across 3 counties had blacklisted Willowbrook Resort after photos of the drained lake went viral on social media. The financial pressure was working exactly as planned. Property values were already dropping as potential buyers canceled house tours and existing homeowners panicked about their investments. The lake that had made everyone's property worth double what they'd paid was now a muddy crater that could be smelled from the main highway. But Delilah's final gambit was pure desperation disguised as community leadership. Monday morning, she filed a federal environmental protection complaint claiming I'd illegally altered protected wetlands and destroyed critical wildlife habitat. The complaint requested immediate federal intervention to prevent further ecological damage by unstable individual. She was trying to frame my legal exercise of easement rights as federal environmental crimes. If successful, I'd face years in prison and hundreds of thousands in fines. She was willing to destroy me completely rather than admit defeat. Time for the nuclear option. Monday evening, I placed calls to every TV station, newspaper, and online publication within 100 miles. By Tuesday morning, the media circus would arrive in Willowbrook Estates, and Delilah would learn what happens when you declare war on someone who controls the water. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Tuesday night. Perfect timing for a very public demonstration of exactly who held the real power in our little suburban paradise. Tuesday night, 7 p.m. The Willowbrook Estates clubhouse hadn't seen this much excitement since the great mailbox placement controversy of 2019. 137 residents packed into a space designed for maybe half that number, creating the kind of standing room only atmosphere usually reserved for championship boxing matches or public executions. Channel 7's news van sat in the parking lot like a mechanical vulture, Rebecca Martinez and her crew setting up cameras that would broadcast our neighborhood drama to 3 counties. The sheriff's department had sent Deputy Williams, a reasonable man who looked like he'd rather be literally anywhere else on earth than refereeing a suburban civil war. But the real entertainment was watching Delilah realize that her carefully orchestrated public lynching had turned into a very public trial with herself as the primary defendant. She'd arranged the meeting expecting to present me as an unstable terrorist who'd sabotaged community infrastructure out of grief-induced madness. Her PowerPoint presentation included dramatic photos of the drained lake, fabricated witness statements about my threatening behavior, and a timeline of my supposed descent into environmental extremism. What she hadn't expected was Marcus Webb standing at the back of the room with a briefcase full of legal documentation, Rosa Martinez in the front row with county engineering maps, and Tank Morrison flanked by 50 blue-collar workers who looked like they'd enjoyed their dinner and were ready for the evening's entertainment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Delilah began, her voice carrying that kindergarten teacher sweetness that preceded total psychological warfare, "we're here tonight to address the environmental terrorism that has destroyed our community's most valuable asset." The murmur that rippled through the crowd wasn't quite the supportive rumble she'd anticipated. Too many people had seen my Facebook posts, watched the news coverage, and started connecting dots that painted a very different picture of recent events. Mr. Crawford's illegal manipulation of our water systems represents a clear and present danger to property values, community safety, and environmental protection, she continued. clicking through slides that would have been convincing if the audience hadn't spent 2 days learning the actual facts. That's when I stood up and requested permission to address the community. Deputy Williams nodded. He'd reviewed the legal documentation Marcus had provided and understood that no actual laws had been broken. "Thank you for allowing me to speak," I said, walking to the front of the room with the kind of calm confidence that comes from holding all the cards. "I want to address Mrs. Thornfield's concerns about environmental terrorism and illegal water manipulation." I pulled out my grandmother's 1962 correspondence with County Flood Control, holding the yellowed papers like sacred texts. These documents establish my family's legal authority over manual flood control infrastructure predating this HOA by 37 years. The silence was so complete you could hear the air conditioning humming like mechanical tension. "The county has confirmed my absolute legal right to operate this infrastructure for flood management purposes," I continued, nodding toward Rosa Martinez, who stood to confirm my statement with official county documentation. "In fact," Rosa announced, her engineering credentials giving weight to every word, "Mr. Crawford is not only legally authorized to control water flow, he's legally obligated to maintain flood control systems on his property." But the real mic drop moment came when I pulled out my phone and called Rosa, who was standing 20 feet away. The room watched in confused silence as she answered, then walked outside toward my property. The clubhouse had large windows overlooking the resort area. Through those windows, everyone could see Rosa at my valve location, live streaming on my phone's video feed displayed on the meeting room's projection screen. "This is a live demonstration of legally authorized flood control maintenance," I announced, as Rosa's hands appeared on camera, grasping the valve handle. "Mrs. Thornfield has spent the last hour describing this as terrorism. Let's see what it actually looks like." Rosa turned the valve 1/4 rotation clockwise. Within minutes, water began flowing back toward the lake, visible through the clubhouse windows as the retention pond behind the building started rising. The gasps and murmurs from the crowd sounded like a congregation witnessing a miracle performed by a very angry God. "The valve returns to normal operation," I continued, watching Delilah's face cycle through confusion, rage, and pure financial panic. "Lake levels will return to normal within 6 hours. No environmental damage, no terrorism, just legal exercise of documented easement rights." Deputy Williams cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I've reviewed all documentation. No laws have been violated. These appear to be legitimate property rights." That's when Eleanor Pratt stood up with her boxes of HOA corruption evidence, and Janet Reese announced she was resigning from the board effective immediately due to unethical conduct by leadership. The room erupted in shouting, accusations, and demands for Delilah's resignation. 3 board members called for an immediate vote of no confidence. Resort management representatives in the back row looked like they were calculating lawsuit damages in real time. Delilah tried to maintain control, shouting about fraud and conspiracy, but her voice was drowned out by 200 angry homeowners who'd finally seen behind the curtain of their suburban dictatorship. As she stormed out of the meeting, screaming threats about destroying everyone, the room burst into applause that followed her through the parking lot like acoustic karma. 6 months later, I was reading about Delilah Thornfield's sentencing in the county newspaper while Henrietta III pecked at my bootlaces. 18 months in minimum security for embezzlement, fraud, and what the judge called conspiracy to commit institutional harassment. Preston's development company had folded faster than a lawn chair in a tornado, taking their lakefront expansion dreams with it. The new HOA board, elected by the largest voter turnout in Willowbrook history, had reversed every action against me within their first week. They reimbursed my legal costs, paid double damages for my demolished coop, and issued a formal apology that now hangs framed in my kitchen next to Sarah's recipe for her famous cornbread. But the real magic happened when our little suburban civil war transformed into something beautiful. The Willowbrook Heritage Garden sprawled across my 2 acres like a living history lesson that smelled like fresh herbs and possibility. Historical displays showed our area's farming past, complete with my grandmother's Depression-era photos and stories about feeding families from this same soil. The educational chicken coop I'd rebuilt with neighborhood volunteers had become a destination for school groups learning that food comes from farms, not grocery stores. Local 4th graders visited monthly for lessons about sustainable agriculture and watershed management. Their teacher, Mrs. Patterson, always brought them during morning egg collection, and the sound of children's laughter mixed with contented clucking was better than any therapy I'd tried since Sarah died. Rosa Martinez, who'd become much more than my county engineering contact, helped establish the property as an official environmental education site. Our weekend watershed consultations had evolved into something that made my neighbor Janet grin like she'd invented romance. Sunday morning coffee over drainage maps had led to helping other communities fight HOA abuse before lawyers got involved. Together, we'd created the Easement Education Fund, a scholarship program that helped rural property owners research their legal rights and protect family land from development vultures. The fund had already prevented 4 families from losing their property to aggressive HOAs using the same tactics Delilah had tried on me. Our success stories read like a greatest hits album of David versus Goliath victories. Margaret Chen kept her son's wheelchair van after we found ADA violations in her HOA's enforcement. Bill Rodriguez's vegetable garden survived when we discovered his deed included agricultural rights. 3 military veterans kept their flagpoles after learning about federal protection laws that supersede HOA aesthetic guidelines. Every Memorial Day, Willowbrook hosts Heritage Festival, our annual celebration of farming history and environmental stewardship that draws families from across 3 counties. Children collect warm eggs while their parents share stories about standing up to institutional bullies and protecting what matters most. The festival raises money for our scholarship fund and creates the kind of positive community connection that makes newspaper editors write feel-good stories instead of crime reports. Last year, we raised $47,000 and helped 16 families avoid foreclosure through HOA harassment. But my favorite moments still happen every sunrise, standing on my back porch with coffee that tastes like contentment, watching new generations of chickens peck peacefully in the same spot where my grandmother's hens lived 60 years ago, the smell of cedar shavings and morning dew, the sight of kids walking to school who wave at Mr. Jazz and ask about today's egg count, the sound of water flowing properly through systems that protect instead of threaten. Sarah would have loved seeing our grief therapy chickens become environmental education stars. She would have laughed at the irony of our worst nightmare becoming our community's greatest success story. Most importantly, she would have been proud that we'd turned personal tragedy into protection for other families facing similar battles. The resort lake sparkles like liquid gold again, but now it comes with respect earned through understanding that water-like power flows to whoever controls the source. I'm the honorary environmental steward for our entire watershed, a position that pays nothing but carries the kind of authority that makes future HOA boards think very carefully before harassing anyone about anything. Property values didn't just recover, they soared. Turns out, having a nationally recognized environmental education site beats having a tyrant running your HOA every single time. Knowledge is power, but shared knowledge is community protection. Share your HOA nightmare story in the comments. You might be featured in our next episode. Subscribe to HOA Stories and hit that notification bell so you never miss another tale of regular people fighting back against suburban tyranny. Because every bully needs to learn that sometimes the quiet guy with the chickens controls the water.
That's all for today's HOA Madness. If watching justice serve itself made your day, smash that like button, share your thoughts down below, and make sure you're subscribed. More outrageous neighborhood showdowns are just around the corner.